Well, welcome to day 14 in our 31-day journey through the book of Proverbs. Each chapter, we're going to look at one per day. Today is Proverbs 14. What we see in this proverb, if you've read it, and I've encouraged you before to make sure you read it a couple times before watching the video and kind of jot down your thoughts, your observations, the things that you see. There's this contrast between the wise and the foolish. Now, we just went through a couple of chapters where the contrast was between the righteous and the wicked. I think we're talking about the same people, but now the writer's using more language about the wise and the foolish and words related to that. For me, I'm just going to share some of the observations I have because this, again, is a chapter with just kind of a bunch of little nuggets of truth and wisdom kind of popcorned in there. But if you pay attention to it, you'll see that there are themes running throughout. So the verse that got my attention, though, and I had this highlighted from when I read through Proverbs, I don't know, about a year ago, that says, "There's a path before each person that seems right, but it ends in death." There's a path before each person that seems right. This should cause us to be cautious, I think, because we know a path that's wrong. We know when we're standing at that, crossroads of we're at a decision point, and we know that this is not the way, like clearly the wrong path. And we still at times go down it. But we should be very cautious because there are times where there is a path before each of us that seems right. It looks right. It seems right, but it's not. It ultimately ends in death, right? The same way that the road of the wicked will end at. So this is where wisdom and discernment come in. This is why even when things seem right, like maybe God's opening some doors, creating some opportunity, it seems like this is God doing some things, this is the right way, that we should pause and pray, ask for wisdom and discernment to make sure, right? Because the enemy's going to disguise things in a way that can easily fool us, trick us, and we find ourselves engaged in a path, on a path that's leading in the wrong direction, that seemed right. So I hope that encourages you. Verses 1 and 11 got my attention, kind of talking about building. Verse 1 says, "A wise woman builds her home. A foolish woman tears it down with her own hands," right? And then in verse 11, it says, "The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the godly will flourish." So just the idea of kind of a dwelling, a home, and a wise woman is building it. A foolish woman's tearing it down. The house of the wicked will be destroyed. Then there's this contrast here between the house of the wicked and the tent of the godly, right? Not the house of the wicked and the house of the godly. It's the house of the wicked and the tent of the godly. And I caught that probably on my third or fourth reading, that we're talking about what we would assume as a permanent structure, a home. The home is destroyed. The home of the wicked is destroyed, but the temporary structure, a tent that's made for a couple of nights, a camping trip, a long weekend. It's hiking, a place of temporary shelter, not near as strong, or in our mind would we ever plan on making a tent our permanent home. But in that temporary dwelling place of the godly will flourish, but that permanent structure of a home of the wicked will be destroyed. That reminded me of the song as a kid about the wise man builds his house upon the rock and the foolish man builds his house upon the sand. And that comes from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. Jesus is ending his Sermon on the Mount, right? Greatest sermon ever preached. And his closing is this illustration. Let me read it for you. It says, "Anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rain comes in torrents and the floodwaters will rise and the winds beat against the house, it won't collapse because it's built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floods come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash." So talking about, listening to God, listening to the words of Jesus, and then building our life, our foundation. He's our foundation for what we build on. And that will weather the storms of this life. But to hear the teaching, to reject it, is to build this life on a soft foundation that will not stand the storms of this life. So I saw that in verses 1 and 11. And then in verse 17 and 29, we talk about tempers, short tempers, our reaction to things, right? In verse 17, it says, a short-tempered people do foolish things. We know this. We've all lost our temper. We normally do things that we regret, wish we hadn't, when we've lost our temper. So short-tempered people do foolish things. And then it says in verse 29, people with understanding control their anger, and a hot temper shows great foolishness. So when we can't control our emotions and we lose our temper, where we do things that ultimately we regret, we do foolish things. And then in verse 29, it not only do we do foolish things, it makes us look foolish. We show great foolishness. And then the other theme I saw in here was that the writer talks about in 3 different verses about the poor. And in verse 21, he says or in verse 20, the poor are despised even by their neighbors, while the rich have many friends. Now that word despised in other translations is hated, shunned, disliked. Here's the point. They're judged. They've been labeled as poor, and then there's a reaction towards them. That's not positive. So we could talk about poor people. We could talk about people in low income situations. We can think about neighborhoods and developments that are, poor people. We could think about the person standing on the exit or on the busy road with the sign asking for, some handouts, and do we judge them? Do we label them? Because it says the poor are despised, they're shunned, they're hated, they're disliked by their neighbors. Neighbors are the people around them. But the rich have many friends. And then in verse 21, he says, it's a sin to belittle one's neighbor. It's a sin. Blessed are those who help the poor. So to judge them, and then other translations, belittle or despise one's neighbor, is a sin. It's a sin to have those feelings towards them. It's a sin to belittle and despise them. But blessings come when we help the poor. Not when we judge them and label them, but when we help them. Not when we critique them, not when we offer good advice, but when we help them. When we become the hands and feet of Jesus, we experience blessing. And then we see in verse 31, and this one really just stood out to me, those who oppress the poor insult their maker, capital M. We're talking about God. I looked at multiple translations. The word maker is maker. It didn't change. Those who oppress the poor, right, try to keep them down, aren't helping them, right, they're holding them. Those people insult their maker. We're insulting God when we do that. But helping the poor honors him. It honors them just in the direct action of helping them. But ultimately, it honors God. So you think about the people in your life that oftentimes we easily can label and we judge and we respond to. And I think that the practice, the truth of this, it goes across all those labels: poor, rich, race, ethnicity, sexuality, whatever, political party. Think about all the things that divide us. And I believe you could, if we despise those people, if we treat them differently because of some situation, some circumstance, right, we're insulting their maker. But when we help, we not only bring honor to them, we bring honor to him. So I hope Proverbs 14 has helped you. I look forward to tomorrow in Proverbs 15. Have a great day. Thanks for being a part.